The elder said it once, at the welcoming feast, and no one wrote it down. This was, S. Savik would later understand, the first irony. The Vethon diplomatic station hung above the gas giant Oreth like a city dreaming of the sea, its coral towers grown over 300 years from living calcium secreted by the station's founding community, each chamber an exhalation of collective will. The humans had been given quarters in the eastern tier, near the warming vents, which was either hospitality or a test. With humans, S. Savik had learned from the archives, it was rarely possible to know in advance. He had been standing at the reception arch when the shuttle docked. The envoy descended the ramp alone, carrying a single bag over one shoulder, the way a person carries something they expect to need for a long time. She was not tall. Her hair was the color of old wood. She wore no insignia, which, in Vethon protocol, meant either that she considered herself beneath ceremony or above it. S. Savik was 70 years old, which among his people meant that he had outlived most of his certainties. He watched the human walk across the receiving floor and thought, "She is counting the exits." "Envoy Corvo," said Delegate Orath, spreading his gill fans in formal welcome. "The Council of Mouths receives you in the season of opening." The human paused. She was, S. Savik saw, watching Orath's fans with the focused attention of someone memorizing a gesture they may need to reproduce. "Thank you," she said. Her pronunciation of the Vethon greeting phrase was careful, not fluent, the pronunciation of someone who had studied from recordings rather than from speakers. "I am glad to be received." The feast was held in the Chamber of Tides, which was large enough to echo. 60 council members arranged themselves by seniority, their fans spread or furled according to the precise gradations of rank that a Vethon child learned before they learned to walk. The human sat where she was placed, at the outer ring, next to S. Savik, who had been given the seat because he was oldest and therefore expected to be patient with novelty. The food was brought, the pale fermented grains that humans could digest, the brackish broth, the dried spice threads that served as gesture rather than sustenance. S. Savik had overseen the menu himself, working from dietary reports that were 20 years out of date. He was relieved when Corvo ate without distress. "You have studied us," he said. "Not enough," she said, "never enough." She was watching the chamber as she spoke, the way the younger delegates moved around Orath, the direction of the fans, who touched whose arm and who did not. S. Savik felt the odd sensation of being observed by someone who was genuinely trying to understand what they were observing. Most species that came to negotiate wanted to understand what they could use. This one seemed to want to understand the thing itself. He said, because he was old enough to say difficult things, "There is something you should know about how we resolve disputes here." She turned to him then, giving him her full attention. "We practice the ritual of release," he said. "When an agreement has grown old or when it has been broken or when the weight of it becomes heavier than the benefit, we release it. We perform the ceremony and the agreement ceases to exist. We begin again. This is," he searched for the word she would understand, "merciful. It prevents the accumulation of grievance." Corvo was quiet for a moment. She looked at her bowl. "And both parties release it," she said. "Both parties perform the ceremony. What if one party doesn't know it's been released?" S. Savik looked at her. Around them the feast continued, the soft sound of fans, the murmur of formal speech, the distant tone of the tide bell marking the hour. "I am telling you this," he said, "so that you will know." He did not say the rest of what he meant. He was not sure even then that she would understand it. And the younger delegates were watching, and Orath's fans were spread in the gesture that meant, among other things, "This elder speaks too much of unnecessary things." Corvo thanked him, and they spoke of small matters for the rest of the meal. When the feast ended, the delegates dispersed to their chambers in the order prescribed by 3 centuries of tradition. S. Savik was the last to leave the hall. He paused at the arch and looked back, and saw that the human was still at the outer table, her bowl pushed aside, writing in a small book she had produced from somewhere. Writing quickly, in the focused way of someone setting down something before it fades. He stood there for a long moment. Then he went to his chamber and lay in the dark above the warming vent and thought about the shape of what was coming. The Vethon word for forgiveness and the word for forgetting share the same root. This is not a coincidence. Savik had explained this to 3 previous alien envoys in his capacity as the Council's historical interpreter. The Kethali, whose memory was distributed across their colony body and therefore functionally infinite, had found it charming. The Dro, who communicated primarily through bioluminescent pattern and for whom all statements were inherently approximate, had found it logical. The Moor, who had no word for either concept, had found it incomprehensible. None of them had looked the way Corvo looked when he explained it to her on the 3rd day, during the orientation walks through the station's lower tiers. She had listened without interrupting, which was either patience or calculation. Then she had said, "So when you release an agreement, you consider it gone, not just set aside but cease to have existed." "The ceremony," Savik said carefully, "makes it so, in the eyes of the community." "But not in the eyes of the other party," she said. "If the other party didn't perform the ceremony." "Both parties perform the ceremony." "You said that before." She stopped walking. They were in the market tier, surrounded by the low hum of barter and the smell of brine and preserved protein. "What happens when one party performs it unilaterally?" Savik did not answer. Above them, the station's coral ceiling showed the traces of 3 centuries of growth, additions and repairs and deliberate shaping, the record of every generation that had lived and decided and built here. He had never noticed before how much it resembled writing. "Elder," she said, not impatiently. "It has happened," he said. "It is permitted by law. We hold that the ceremony has power regardless of whether the other party is present. The release is real." She nodded slowly. She was writing something in the small book, which she carried in her jacket pocket and produced without apparent thought, the way another person might produce a hand for balance. "I'm going to tell you something," she said. "As a courtesy." He waited. "Humans don't work that way. We can't release things by ceremony. We can choose not to act on what we remember sometimes, but we can't make the memory cease to exist." She looked up at him. "I don't say this as a threat. I say it because you told me something true about your people, and I think you deserve the same." Savik thought, if Oreth were here, he would call this a pleasant curiosity, a charming limitation of a less developed species. He thought, if I were 40 years younger, I might have agreed. "I understand," he said. She nodded and put the book away, and they continued through the market. She asked him about the coral growing, and he told her, and she asked questions that surprised him in their specificity, not the questions of a diplomat looking for leverage, but the questions of someone who found the thing itself interesting. By the time they reached the upper tiers, where the negotiating chambers were, Savik had told her more about the station's history than he had told anyone in years. He did not tell Oreth about the conversation. 6 days later, the Council of Mouths convened to begin the formal negotiations. The table in the central chamber was round, which was Vethon philosophy-made furniture, no head, no hierarchy of position. Corvo sat with her translator device and her small book. The council members sat with their precedents and their centuries of practice. Oreth opened by invoking the agreements made with the previous human envoy, a man named Pell who had served 12 years ago. He summarized the trade provisions, the travel corridors, the shared resource zones along the Oreth approach. His fan spread slowly as he spoke, the gesture of someone recounting well-known history. Then he said, with the particular careful neutrality of a man delivering news he expects to be received easily, "Of course, the Council exercised its right of release regarding the Annex 3 provisions 18 months ago. As we are beginning fresh, those particular terms are no longer applicable." As Savik watched the human's face, she did not react the way he had feared she would, not with anger, not with the raised voice that some species used as a pressure tactic. She was still. Her hands were flat on the table. She looked at Orath with an expression that Savik found difficult to interpret. Then she opened the small book. "I have here," she said, "a summary of the verbal agreement made between Envoy Pell and Delegate First Orath on the 17th day of the Vethon month of receding, 12 years ago. The Annex 3 provisions were agreed upon in exchange for the human corridor rights through sectors 11 through 14. I also have the record of every subsequent session in which those corridor rights were exercised. 231 transits in 12 years. The chamber was silent. "I'm happy to share the full record," she said. "I compiled it from the mission logs, the transit manifests, and the communication transcripts. It took me about 4 hours." Orath's fans moved through a rapid sequence that Savik recognized as the gesture of someone reorganizing their understanding of a situation. "The release," Orath said, "was properly performed under Vethon law." "I don't doubt it was," Corvo said, "but Envoy Pell was not present for it. The human mission was not notified, and the corridor rights have continued to be used as collateral in 3 subsequent negotiations with other species." She closed the book. "I'm not here to make accusations. I'm here to negotiate in good faith, but I think we should begin from an accurate account of where we are." No one spoke. Then Savik said from his place at the far end of the table, "I told you." He said it quietly. He was not certain whether he was speaking to Orath or to himself, or to the shape of what he had tried, 12 years and 6 days ago, to prevent. No one answered him. Corvo asked for 3 days. She did not explain why. Orath, whose fans had not fully settled since the book appeared, agreed without the ceremony of deliberation that the situation usually warranted. Savik watched the human gather her materials and leave the chamber. At the door she paused, not looking back, and said to no one in particular, "Thank you for the orientation walks, Elder. They were genuinely helpful." Then she was gone, and the chamber sat with what remained. She did not come back angry. That was the thing Savik had tried to explain, and that no one had understood until now. He had not slept well in 3 days. Neither, he suspected, had Orath, whose official reports to the station community had grown notably brief. The younger delegates had spent the interval debating whether the human would return with fleet support, or with lawyers, or with the kind of economic leverage that came from coordinating with the 7 other species who had agreements with the Vethon. None of them had considered what she actually returned with. She came back on the morning of the 3rd day, alone, carrying the small book and a data tablet she had not brought before. She asked to address the full council in the Chamber of Mouths, which was the formal space, the one with the high carved ceiling and the tide bell and the seats of 3 centuries of precedent. They gathered because there was nothing in their law that permitted them not to. Corvo stood at the center of the round room. She had dressed more carefully than usual, not formally by Vethon standards, but with the deliberate attention to appearance that Savik recognized as someone who understood that how you looked when you said a difficult thing affected whether the difficult thing could be heard. She set the tablet on the stand provided and looked out at the assembled council. "I've spent 3 days," she said, "compiling a record." She spoke without preamble. The record she had assembled covered 240 years of Vethon diplomatic history, agreements made and released, with 7 different species, cross-referenced against what those species had subsequently reported to the Interstellar Archive. She had accessed the archive from her quarters using her envoy clearance. She had then, with the patience that Savik was beginning to understand as a specifically human characteristic, sorted and annotated and organized everything she found. "I want to be clear about what this is," she said. "It is not an accusation. It is a record. It shows a pattern not of bad faith, but of a genuine structural problem. Your release ceremony is internally coherent. It works exactly as intended within your community, but it has no power over outside minds. And over 240 years, the Vethon Council has released, unilaterally, 14 significant agreements with 6 different species, in all 14 cases after deriving the primary benefit of the agreement. In most cases, the other party was not informed. The chamber was still. Outside, the tide bell marked the hour. The other species remember, she said. They don't remember in the way you do as a wound they're obligated to release. They remember the way a river remembers where it has been, which is to say, it is simply where it is, shaped by where it has gone. She paused. I'm not here to tell you that your way of processing the past is wrong. It may be the most merciful system any species has developed, but mercy to function must be mutual. A release that only one party performs is not mercy. It is erasure. Orath said, You speak as if we acted in malice. I speak as if you acted in the only way your culture trained you to act, Corvo said. That's what makes it a structural problem rather than a moral one, and structural problems can be addressed. She pulled up the record on the tablet. 240 years, annotated in the neat, precise notation of someone who had learned to write under conditions where clarity could mean survival. She offered it to the council, not as a weapon, Savek thought, not as leverage, but the way you offer a map to someone who has been navigating without one. What I'm proposing, she said, is simple. Going forward, any release performed by the Vethon Council regarding an agreement with another species requires notification. The other party doesn't have to agree to the release. You can still release it, but they will know, and they will have the opportunity to note the release in their own records. The chamber erupted, not in shouting, which was not Vethon, but in the rapid, complex fan language of deep disagreement, multiple conversations layering over each other, delegates turning to their neighbors, Orath conferring with his inner circle in the rapid-fire shorthand of people who have argued a long time. Savik sat and watched the human. She was not performing patience. She was actually patient, which was different. She stood at the center of the room while the arguments moved around her, and waited with the stillness of someone who has said the thing that needed to be said, and is now prepared to wait as long as necessary for the world to catch up. Orath called for a recess. The delegates filtered out. Corvo remained because no one had told her to leave, and leaving had not occurred to her. Savik found himself walking toward her. He was not certain why. Perhaps it was 70 years of watching his people practice forgetting, and the sudden awareness of what the sum of all that forgetting looked like from the outside. You compiled all of that in 3 days, he said. I'm a fast reader, she said, and I had good notes from the orientation walks. He stood beside her and looked at the 240 years arranged on the tablet, 14 agreements, 6 species, the record of what the Vethon ceremony looked like from the other side of it. May I ask you something? He said. Yes. Do humans forgive? She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. This was, Savik thought, the thing he had noticed at the feast, the way she took even small questions seriously, as if every question might be the one that mattered. Yes, she said, but we don't forget what we're forgiving. The forgiveness and the memory exist at the same time. One doesn't cancel the other. He thought about this for a long time. That must be very difficult, he said. Sometimes, she said, sometimes it's what makes it mean something. The delegates returned. The arguments resumed, quieter now, moving through the formal register that meant a decision was being approached. Corvo returned to her position at the center. Savik returned to his seat at the far end of the chamber. The council agreed, before the tide bell rang again, to the notification provision. Orath delivered the agreement in the flat tones of someone who has been convinced of something, and is not yet comfortable with having been convinced. The younger delegates would debate it for years, Savik knew. Some would see it as capitulation. Some, eventually, would understand it as the thing it was, an adjustment, a small structural change that made a mercy into something that functioned like one. After the session ended, S. Savick asked for an empty office and sat for a long time in the quiet above the warming vents. He was thinking about the feast, about the human sitting at the outer table after everyone had left, writing in the small book in the fast, focused way of someone who knows that memories are not permanent and acts accordingly. He had watched her and thought, how exhausting to have to write everything down. He had not considered until now the other side of it, that if you wrote everything down, it still existed, that the thing you wrote could be found, could be given to someone who needed it, could sit in an archive for 240 years and still be exactly what it was, unchanged, unceremonialized, simply and stubbornly there. The Vethon had been practicing mercy for 300 years. They were very good at it. The coral ceiling above him was the record of every generation that had decided together how to live, and built the decision into the structure of the station, and that record was permanent and beautiful and legible to anyone who knew how to look. He reached into the pocket of his outer layer, where he kept things he was not sure what to do with, and found a stylus he had not used in perhaps a decade. He placed a sheet of the station's pressed fiber paper on the desk in front of him. He thought for a while about what he wanted to write down, and what it meant that he wanted to write it. The tide bell rang once, marking the quarter hour. Outside, the gas giant turned in its ancient, indifferent way, and the station hung above it, growing slowly, shaped by every hand that had ever lived and decided and built within it. Then S. Savick, who was 70 years old and had outlived most of his certainties, began, for the first time in his life, to write something down.